So one of the changes that Apple made on the iPhone 16 Pro is they took the 12 megapixel sensor of the ultra-wide lens and they replaced it with a 48 megapixel sensor. So this means that you can shoot 48 megapixel ultra-wide photography now with the iPhone, but it also means that you can shoot 48 megapixel macro photography because the ultra-wide lens is the lens used for macro shots on the iPhone. Now the ultra-wide lens itself is the same 13 millimeter full frame equivalent f2.2 aperture lens that's found on the 15 Pro and the 14 Pro models. But what's actually different is the sensor behind the lens is now capable of those 48 megapixel shots instead of just the 12 megapixel shots. So in this video, we're gonna take some 48 megapixel ultra wide shots with the iPhone 16 Pro, and we will compare it to the previous generation ultra wide camera found on the 14 Pro. Again, it's the same camera that's on the 15 Pro as well. But we're gonna do some side-by-side comparisons and we'll see how the two cameras stack up against each other. And I'm gonna do some ultra-wide landscape shots out here, and then I'll also do some macro photography so we can compare that as well. All right, so here I have a bunch of images that we will compare. So I mentioned earlier that the iPhone 16 Pro's ultra-wide camera has a 48 megapixel sensor. Well, it's not a traditional 48 megapixel sensor. So Apple is using quad pixel sensor technology to output 48 megapixel files. So this allows for various computational photography processes, which I think is generally a good thing for tiny sensor cameras like the ones in our smartphones. But anyway, for this video, we're not going to get into all the technical details of the sensor here. I really just want to focus on the end result, which would be the actual images that the phone produces, and we'll see if it's worth shooting in 48 megapixel mode or not. Now, for this video, I shot everything in JPEG format because I don't think most people are shooting RAW on their phones, and I just wanted to let each phone process the images using their computational photography. But let's go ahead and take a closer look at these images. Now, one thing I want to point out is that when we're looking at images globally like this, we're not going to see much difference between the images. I mean, each image is only taking up around 4 to 4.5 megapixels of area on my computer screen. So, viewing a 48 megapixel image on a 4 megapixel area, I mean, you're just not going to see what's actually going on in the file. So what I like to do in comparisons like this is just zoom into 100%. So that way we have a 1-to-1 pixel ratio between the images and the computer screen. So right away you can see the obvious resolution difference here. And what I'm noticing is that yes, there's more resolution on the 16 Pro, and you can see maybe a little bit more detail in some of these areas, but I wouldn't call this image like super sharp. I mean, it does look good for a phone, but I think maybe there's a limiting factor at play here, and that would be the lens. I'm thinking that the ultra-wide lens on the phone is probably not capable of completely resolving 48 megapixels of detail because there does seem to be a bit of softness to the image. Whereas the 12 megapixel file on the right here, just seems to be a little bit more crisp and sharp, at least to my eye. But if we downscale the 16 Pro file to 12 megapixels, what I notice here is that it actually gives a slightly sharper result than the 14 Pro. Now it's not by a ton, but there is a small difference I can see in some of these areas. There does also seem to be a small color difference, but nothing major. They are mostly the same. And keep in mind that I let each phone choose the settings for these shots, so there may be some differences resulting from like different white balance and exposure settings that the phone used. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at our next comparison. And globally, again, we're not going to notice any difference. And we'll go ahead and take a look at 100%. And you can see the resolution difference here. And the 48 megapixels is letting us see a little bit more detail. But again, it's just a little bit soft, but it's still very good for a mobile device. I think the 12 megapixel image here looks pretty good. The softness from the lens is not nearly as noticeable at the lower resolution. If anything, the shot is over sharpened a little bit. But let's take a look at a downscaled version, taking the 48 megapixel image to 12 megapixels, and we pretty much get a similar result as the previous image. The downscaled image does look a little bit better than the 12 megapixel shot on the 14 Pro. I see a little bit more clarity, and it actually looks slightly less over sharpened, just a little bit less crunchy. I mean, is it a humongous difference? No, but I do see a small difference here. Alright, so next we'll take a look at some macro shots. Now the B here is slightly out of focus on the 48 megapixel file. It was a little tricky shooting the B since it was moving around and I was trying not to get stung. But if we take a look here, I do think that having 48 megapixels for macro work is pretty nice. I can definitely see more detail on the B even though the focus wasn't perfect. But the 12 megapixel file here, it still looks really nice. I mean, it's pretty amazing that we're able to get this kind of detail with our phones nowadays. And if we look at a downscaled image, now the images to me are pretty neck and neck here. So I have another macro example of a B. Now for these, I'm not exactly the same distance from the B, but we can go ahead and compare. And man, these macro shots really do show a nice level of detail. On this 48 megapixel shot, you can see the hair and the textures on this B, all this detail on the wing. And the 12 megapixel shot looks really good as well. But I do like that extra resolution on the 48 megapixel shot. And if we downscale and take a look, I'd say for this particular shot that the 14 Pro actually looks just a little bit better. I think I was able to get better focus for that shot, but I do think both images here are pretty nice. Alright, so next let's just take a look at the flower here, and I'll zoom into 100%. And this is definitely pretty awesome for a phone. So I can make out more detail here on the higher resolution image. Now, is it mind-blowingly better? I mean, no, I wouldn't say that, but we can see more detail for sure. And if we look at this one downscaled, I'd say they are pretty much the same as far as the detail. I do like the color better on the 14 Pro shot for this particular image. And next I have another macro image, this time of some tree bark. Now the 14 Pro, to me, it does look more crisp, more sharp, even though I can see a little more detail on the 48 megapixel shot. I mean, if that makes sense. And we'll look at a downscaled version of this one as well. And to me, they look basically the same as far as the detail. Not a huge difference there. Alright, so after all these shots, what is my conclusion here? Well, first let's take a minute and ask, why would somebody want to shoot with a high resolution camera that has a lot of megapixels in the first place? Well, there are a few general advantages. Now, I'm not talking about the iPhone specifically here. I'm referring to cameras in general, but those advantages of high resolution images include the ability to make better detailed, larger sized prints. There's also the advantage in being able to crop into an image and still be left with a decent amount of resolution after the crop. And then another benefit is just the ability to see more detail when looking at images closely. Now, obviously not everyone is into that, but a lot of photo enthusiasts such as myself, we do enjoy pixel peeping a bit. And of course, there's also the benefit of better digital zoom quality when you're shooting. Now, that's just another form of cropping, but having more megapixels does typically give better results with digital zoom. Now, is 48 megapixels necessary for posting to your social media account? Absolutely not. It's total overkill for that purpose. I mean, 48 megapixels is also overkill for just viewing on your phone, or even a 4K monitor for that matter, unless you're zooming way into the image and whatnot. I mean, a 4K monitor is 3,840 pixels by 2,160 pixels, and if you multiply those numbers, you get the total number of pixels, which is over 8.2 million pixels. So that's a little over 8 megapixels. Now, the iPhone 16 Pro Max's display is 2,868 by 1,320 pixels, so that's a total of 3.7 megapixels. So yeah, 48 megapixels is definitely overkill. But again, high resolution shots in general do have the advantages that I mentioned earlier. Now, as far as the images that we're getting from the iPhones, well, I don't really think that the 48 megapixel shots are really giving us a huge improvement, because I think the ultrawide lens it's probably not totally capable of resolving all of those megapixels. I mean, it is a tiny lens that we're talking about here. That said, I did see some slight improvement in the landscape shots when downscaling the image, so that does indicate to me that we're getting a little bit more detail out of the 48 megapixel sensor, but it's not by a huge margin, and you have to pixel peep to notice. Now, with the macro shots, I do think the higher resolution, it's nice to have for certain subjects, such as the bee images that we looked at, but taken as a whole,
I'd say that the previous generation ultra-wide camera is pretty much just as good as the new one. I'd say if anything, we're getting just a small bump in detail from the 48 megapixel camera. I think what would really improve the quality would be if Apple redesigned and improved the actual ultra-wide lens itself. I mean, hopefully they do that in the future, but overall, the image quality that we're able to get out of phone cameras nowadays, it's pretty awesome. I mean, it's definitely not a replacement for my full frame camera gear, but phones have definitely come a long way over the years. But are the iPhone 16 Pro's cameras worthy of upgrading your iPhone? I mean, if you have an older iPhone, then you probably will notice better shots. But if you have an iPhone made in the last few years, let's say, and it's working well for you, I mean, I'd say save your money and wait for like the iPhone 17 or the 18 perhaps. Alright, well that's it for now. I'll see ya on the next video.